Good morning and welcome to the Full Scottish on a day which most people seem to agree is the official first day of autumn. We've been having unseasonably hot weather this week. Perhaps it's apt then this is also the week where Britain and most of the planet actually was involved in massive climate change protests. Sticking with the idea of protest, it's also the week where Joanna Cherry proved that it is actually possible to have a press conference in the face of noisy demonstrators, something our Prime Minister didn't feel he was able to do. Then there was the one-man protest against Boris Johnson in the NHS, which has caused a whole heap of misery on social media. The Labour Party seems determined to continue to eat itself, and we'll be talking about the Labour Party conference a little bit this morning. And the EU continues to scratch its head over the non-proposal proposals and the fact that the EU want to keep them kind of secret. Joining me today to discuss all of these, some of these or perhaps none of these issues, are my guests. Professor Aileen McHarg, Professor of Public Law and Human Rights at Durham University, very recently of Durham University, previously University of Strathclyde, and Kenny McBride, a Wheel Kent face from Scotland at 7. Good morning to you both. So let's start then with the big talk of the big story of the week, Supreme Court. We hope to hear the result of the appeals next week. Aileen, could you just put the several different strands of appeal that are going on through the Supreme Court into some kind of context for viewers?
Okay, so there are two appeals that are being heard together. One was brought in the Scottish courts by Joanna Cherry and 70-odd other MPs and peers. And then the second case was brought by Gina Miller, who's a political anti-Brexit campaigner in the English courts. And the two cases so far have had different outcomes. So the Cherry case, the Inner House of the Court of Session found that the prorogation was unlawful. But in the Miller case, in the Divisional Court in London, held that the issue was what it called non-justiciable. Now, non-justiciable is a word that lawyers use to mean not something that the court was competent to decide upon. So that meant the government won in that case. So these cases have been joined on appeal to the Supreme Court, and at the Supreme Court level, various other parties have got involved. John Major, the Lord Advocate for the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, and also somebody called Raymond McCord, who's a victims campaigner in Northern Ireland, who had tried to bring a similar case in Northern Ireland, but the Northern Irish courts declined to decide that issue because it was already being dealt with in Scotland and in England. So he's intervened in the case also to argue that the prorogation was unlawful. So the court has to make a decision. Does it agree with the Divisional Court in London that it's non-justiciable? Does it agree with the Inner House that it is both justiciable and unlawful? Or does it go for some kind of halfway house? It might decide that it's justiciable, but it's not unlawful. So there's a range of possible outcomes that could be reached.
So Kenny, as a kind of Mr. Everyman, who's not a constitutional lawyer, unless it's something about you I don't know, how are you finding all of this?
I find it all quite disturbing, to be honest. We shouldn't be being governed in court. That shouldn't be how a democracy works. We shouldn't have to spend time worrying about, well, will the Prime Minister obey the law or not? You know, that shouldn't be a question that comes up in a functioning country.
So are you worried then that the court should, are you taking the view that the court should not be involved in this, that they have no legal competency to rule on this at all?
I don't know. I mean, I think you have to have politicians answerable to the courts at some point. It just bothers me that we've got to this stage where the Prime Minister has thought that he could just do, because I think even if it comes out that it's not justiciable, or if the court decides that it is lawful, the fact that the Prime Minister has such disregard for democracy and so much contempt for Parliament anyway, and it's not just Boris Johnson. It's been like this for a while, and it's been getting worse, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when the High Court and when the appeal, when the court fell in Scotland, and I thought, well, do you know, that's maybe the right thing. Maybe actually we don't want courts and the law becoming involved in politics. Because what will happen is that will be used against them. So in fact, if they did find in favour, then we saw what happened when they did. People got very upset, started to claim that they were being politically influenced, that they weren't independent. And the independence of the judiciary is absolutely key and a key cornerstone of our democracy. However, I think I'm now moving to the position, as you've just suggested, that the Prime Minister is acting with such disregard for the law in its widest sense that at some point someone has to be called to account. And they refuse point blank to say whether they would prorogue again. Dominic Raab was asked this morning 3 times and he refused to say yes or no. What do you think they will do, Aileen?
I have no idea what they will do. I mean, the prediction has been for a long time has been a mug's game in relation to any aspect of Brexit. I mean, whether that's a possibility will depend on the nature of the decision that the court makes, the way in which it reaches its reasoning. If it decides, if the basis of its decision is about the effect, we've shut down Parliament for 5 weeks and that's too long, then maybe a shorter prorogation is okay. But if they're concerned about motive, and motive being about evading parliamentary scrutiny, then a prorogation to evade parliamentary scrutiny again might be unlawful. But it's very, as you say, it's very, very difficult territory here for the courts. The courts, when they decide that something is non-justiciable, are concerned about themselves, about their own authority. I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague on Friday, and the way he put it was to say, well, the courts they don't want to get themselves into the position either where they're seen not to be obeyed, so that's one problem, but also where they might be seen to put in train a series of events which turn out to be bad in some way. And this is very, very difficult for them. They're not experts in parliamentary procedure, they're not political experts. The issue of what the remedies should be for this case have been very contentious. Is Parliament still in session? Does it have to be?
Yeah,
does a clean seat have to be
issue of
brought forward?
precedent is the worrying
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely.
You see, I suspect behind this is are darker moves. I mean, it's quite clear that Johnson is trying to ramp up support, populist support, first of all against Parliament, calling Parliament the enemy of the people. Now that's extremely dangerous. If we were going to play fascist bingo and look at all the things you have to tick before you start moving towards a state of fascism, well, that's right up there, making Parliament the enemy of the people. And there are enough people worked up about this to a huge extent that that's getting a lot of discussion on social media, and it's now moving into mainstream media. Next thing is, let's attack the courts. Now, it happened earlier in Brexit when the courts ruled against the government, and we can all remember the headlines where all the judges were, pictures were in the Daily Telegraph and other papers under the headline, enemy of the people. We saw the judges in Scotland who upheld the appeal being denounced for being people who went to France on holiday.
Yes.
I mean, it's people going into people's private lives. It's been happening again. That's really worrying. That's the, if you like, the insidious side of it. So as well as the big questions about whether this has, if they have got legal competency or not, whether this is going to set a dangerous precedent, alongside of this is Boris Johnson trying to attack 2 of the pillars of democracy in this country, the law and Parliament, and working the populace up against that. And that really, really frightens me. Does it frighten you?
Oh, I mean, I think it's you don't want to impute motives onto people.
I do all the time.
Well, I don't want to. Although ironically, that's in some sense what the court has to do. But yeah, if you were planning on establishing a dictatorship, I think you would go about it more or less exactly the way Johnson has. You would start by denouncing all the stupid laws that you get, all the bad decisions that judges make, which is something that politicians do anyway. It's especially sort of populist right wingers. Is this is terrible. Judges are too lenient. We need to do things more, whatever it is. But you would then start attacking the press. You would start attacking the justiciary. You would start attacking the concept of Parliament. You would lie about everything. And
here we go, fascist bingo again. We've already met all of these conditions except attacking the press.
Well, I mean,
they're on his side.
It's not unusual though for you to hear about all the liberal Remainers in the BBC, whereas a lot of us who are on the Remain side look at the BBC and go, you didn't really help with the whole Brexit thing. If you're all
came out this week and said exactly that.
If you're all elite Remainer liberals, you didn't do a great job of presenting the case against Brexit. You didn't do a great case of calling out the lies of the Brexiteers. So, there's all the warning signs are there, and we always say, like, how did the Germans not see it coming in the 30s? Because you should have seen it coming. There was, you had the violence on the streets, you had, organised violence on the streets, the same attacks on the press, attacks on judges, and we've had all of those things. And now we're at a point where they're saying, and Parliament's not going to sit either.
Yeah, it's.
It should be more frightening, I think, than it is.
I mean, I get it's easy for people to, claim that Johnson's a dictator and clearly he's not, and to draw parallels with Hitler. But I think that's a bit simplistic. But I do think we have to look at this in the light of a move to the far right that is happening across Western democracies and parallel to things that are happening in the United States. Do you know, I discovered this week reading a book I had a long time to wait in Brussels airport this week, and I picked up a book called Fascism, A Warning, and it by Madeleine Albright. And I hadn't realised that the person who first used the phrase draining the swamp was Goebbels, not Trump.
Wow.
And I did a wow and got my pen out and underlined it in the book. Just want to move on from this quite soon, but there's another issue around Parliament not sitting at the moment, which could be a concern. Obviously, things are ramping up now in the Gulf with Saudi. America has said it will deploy boots on the ground. What if Britain is asked to do something similar or to cover with airstrikes and Parliament is not sitting? Can anyone else call back Parliament, or could Johnson just agree to this and once again Parliament doesn't scrutinise?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is, while Parliament is prorogued, only the Prime Minister can advise the Queen to recall Parliament. I mean, we're in the territory here of another prerogative power. The deployment of armed forces is a Crown prerogative, and the requirement of parliamentary approval, if it is a requirement of parliamentary approval, is only a matter of convention. It's still very unclear exactly whether that is a binding rule or not, if there are exceptions to it. So we're in another area of the Constitution where everything is dependent on political rules, where there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's problematic.
I think that would come as a shock to most people who assume that it has to be parliamentary rule, not just executive decision by royal approval.
No.
Let's not get into the Queen, because we could be here for a week, and I actually think what he did or didn't say to the Queen in this issue is of kind of minor importance. Sticking with Brexit, Howard, just for a little bit longer, Labour Party conference started. We are going to, apparently they're going to debate Brexit tomorrow. Jeremy Corbyn must be the only person in the United Kingdom who wants to stay neutral on this. Now, even the Liberal Democrats, who I often call the party that likes to say maybe, have clearly come out on one particular issue. We might talk about that in a minute. But Jeremy Corbyn wants to stay neutral, and clearly the suggestion is that conference doesn't. So are we set for yet another major falling out amongst thieves in the Labour Party? What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of days?
I mean, predicting the Labour Party is a mug's game. I don't know what will happen. I think Jeremy Corbyn is also the only person in Britain who could lead the Labour Party and not be leading in the polls right now. I mean, that takes a special kind of incompetence to be running, to have had Theresa May, who even at the best of times is not charismatic or likeable at all. And then Boris Johnson, who a vast chunk of the country absolutely despises. That's the two leaders he's been facing at a time when the Tory party has been at war with itself, has been working on an ever-decreasing majority in Parliament, has not been able to get anything useful done for 3 years. and he's still not leading in the polls.
But
I mean, it's absurd. I mean, and it kind of came to a head the other week when just before Parliament was prorogued, when after all this time saying we want a general election, we want a general election, we want a general election, the chance came where he could have won vote of no confidence, and he didn't want it.
Oh, but that's because they knew that Johnson would just lie again and change the date. And I think it wasn't just him. Every other opposition party supported that move. I think that was the right move to date, because you can't just trust Boris Johnson. They had to get the agreement that the letter would be sent. Now it turns out that letter asking for a withdrawal probably hasn't got the legal strength that we thought it did, but that was why they did it.
Yeah.
And it was easy for them to call him chicken, but I think it was quite a strategic move.
I understand that there was reason behind it, but it looks so weak. I think a lot of people will not have seen, oh well, you know, I kind of understand why they did that. A lot of people will look at it and go, Corbyn just doesn't have a spine. He can't, because
but worse than not having a spine,
if he can't be leading in the polls now, he can't win at all.
Worse than not having a spine, if the Labour Party do not have a clear, identifiable policy on Brexit, that in itself is going to make a no-deal Brexit exit likely, don't you think?
Well, if we can't get a majority in Parliament for something other than a no-deal Brexit, yes, we get a no-deal Brexit. We can't keep postponing indefinitely. But I think you're maybe being a bit unfair on Jeremy Corbyn, because going back to what you said earlier about Boris Johnson trying to pit the people against Parliament, in a sense, the people have been pitted against Parliament right from the word go in the Brexit process, and this has been a major issue. We had a narrow majority to leave in the referendum, but clearly we had about 70% support for Remain in Parliament, and for the major parties to try and negotiate that has been very, very difficult. Now the Lib Dems have staked out a very strong we'll just revoke position, but that doesn't go down well with a lot of people. I mean, I was in a taxi this morning.
It's neither Liberal nor Democratic,
no,
I would suggest.
I was in a taxi this morning and the taxi driver said, oh, I don't really care whether we leave or remain, but the people voted, we should just get on with it. These MPs are standing in the way. You know, that attitude is out there. So Labour, who have to, if they're going to govern, have to appeal to a broad church, are in a very, very difficult position. They don't have the luxury of the Lib Dems of hoovering up the ultra Remain vote
and knowing that they'll never be in power, so the revoking Article 50 is not a reality. But it seems to me that about 80% of the Labour membership is Remain, but he knows that in key constituencies in the north of England they voted to leave, traditional Labour voters. Yeah. But it seems that he's not being able to get himself out from that issue, and he needs to, as all leaders of parties do, think about the best for the country. And he must surely know by now that a no-deal Brexit is not going to help those people in the northeast of England, in the northwest of England, that he's most concerned about. And it's this fear that he will lose votes to Brexit and lose his own sense of power that's hindering him from doing the right thing. And it's back about putting country before party, and he's not doing that. I mean, okay, Nicola Sturgeon is fortunate that 62% of people in Scotland voted to Remain, but lots of people in her own party didn't vote to Remain. But she's put that aside and said, well, I'm First Minister of Scotland, it's what's good for Scotland, knowing that she will lose votes. And with the general election coming up, that might be an issue, and the Scottish general election quite soon, but it's what's right for country. And he seems not to be doing that. And I think that's what you want in an opposition leader. If the government is not putting the country first, then the very least you expect is the opposition to take the opposite view and do that. And he's not doing it. And in amongst all of this, we have this nonsense about this coup to try and get rid of Tom Watson by this Momentum, who some people have been describing in the press this week as a cult. And he's hedged on that as well. He seems to be supporting him, but he's maybe not supporting him. And that's not going to help, is it? It's not sending out a clear message that there is an alternative for people who can't vote for a fourth party like Plaid Cymru or the SNP or other parties in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, okay, maybe we've done the Labour Party to death. In fact, I think the Labour Party are doing themselves to death quite without any help from us. I want to just move on into something in one way closer to home and also global, and that is climate change. So we saw yesterday thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators across the UK, mostly young people taking part in demonstrations. I caught the demonstration in George Square briefly, going between meetings. It was a beautiful day. It was joyous. It was interesting, some local authorities in Scotland took a stance that they would allow their school pupils to have the day off. They thought that was right. Others didn't. I don't know if either of you have kids who were involved in this, but do you think it's right that young people should be told, yes, if you want to demonstrate on a thing like this, you can take the day off, or is that school's becoming interested in politics and that shouldn't happen?
Well, I have a son who's 12, and he didn't take part, which I actually was rather disappointed about. I would have been fully supportive if he had done. I mean, I think the schools are there to educate citizens, aren't they? And on an issue like this, it is of such importance to their future that not to to kind of pretend that that's got nothing to do with education, I think would be a little bit problematic. And missing the odd day of school here and there is not going to be the end of the world. It really isn't. So I think those schools or those local authorities who have been facilitative, I think they are doing the right thing.
But then, Kenny, what happens come Independence 2 when kids want to take the day off school to support Yes or whatever the No campaign's called this time? That really does begin to feel political. And schools are very careful about that. They're very careful about not letting politicians be seen to be influencing what's happening in the schools. So where does that lie? Is it a bit of a silly thing for schools to have agreed to?
I mean, I think it probably makes some kids less likely to go because it feels less rebellious then. I think one of
psychology.
I mean, I do think one of the things that is good about this is that young people are saying, "My God, look at the mess you've made." It's holding the. I mean, I don't have kids of my own, but it does kind of hold the rest of us accountable. Where some of us and maybe people my parents' age are thinking, well, I've not got much time to go anyway, so who cares? Whereas when kids stand up and say, no, you made a mess that I've got to clean up, that's not fair. And I think probably a lot of families understand that precise argument. So yeah, I think it's good if kids are encouraged to be involved in politics. I think it's good if they're encouraged to take a stand on things. And yeah, I mean, if I had kids who wanted to go, I mean, I'm never going to tell my kids they shouldn't strike if they think that's their best political weapon. They should have an absolute right to. They should have a right to close.
Well, children have got more right to strike probably than workers have now in this country, to be honest.
That's something that schools are very, but primary schools, they have rights respecting schools, they have eco schools initiatives, so they are doing things which are, political with a small p. It's where you draw the line when something becomes political with a large P. And I take your point, but we shouldn't pretend that there aren't questions of value being discussed in school, and questions which are, in a broad sense, highly political questions.
And how much of the issues around climate change are in the curriculum? Because it's so long since my daughter was at school. I wouldn't know.
I wouldn't know either, because my son doesn't tell me anything about what he does at school.
I mean, from what little I do know, I believe there is quite a bit, especially in sort of first and second year science. Quite a lot of what they talk about is climate science. It's kind of used as a way into several other topics, so that's a good thing. I think with anything, the younger you get people involved, the more likely they are to carry on that interest over their life. So I think anything we can do that gets young people thinking about politics and thinking about the difference that their activity can make.
Well, that's my next question.
Is a big deal.
Can they make a difference? So how many of us over the years have been on protests, big and small, where we were convinced this was going to change it? The Stop the War Coalition is the biggest demonstrations that ever happened in the United Kingdom. Across the world, they were some of the biggest. It didn't change policy one little bit. Given that climate change is out with the gift of any single government, even one that is sitting, what difference will it make? Will it bring politicians to book? Will it make them think differently? Oh, I might not get elected if I don't pay some lip service, but then is it just lip service? It's not to... growing up in a political household, out demonstrating and marching from almost as soon as I could walk, I agree. I think it's fantastic to get younger people involved. We're very easily to dismiss young people. Oh, they're not interested in politics. They're maybe not interested in party politics, but they're interested in the bigger issues. But will it make a difference? Or are we, as a citizenship, just being misled into thinking? It's like all the petitions we sign on social media, are we just being misled into thinking we've actually got power, when what we're seeing, talking from things from the top of the programme, is we don't have any power at all?
Well, I mean, sometimes, of course, they can make a difference, and the anti-poll tax campaign would be a good example of that. But it's maybe wrong to expect a kind of immediate cause and effect. Protests and campaigns are about raising awareness, they're about building momentum, they're about educating the people who take part. And so, you might see the effect in a much more diffuse way or further down the line. I think what's maybe important about this, particularly at this time, is Brexit has crowded out everything. It has nothing else is happening. Well, Parliament's prorogued, there's no bills being passed. Here is people saying, look, don't forget about this issue. We actually really care about this, and it is something we expect you to be taking action over. So, I think we might not see a change in policy immediately, but it's nevertheless important in keeping that issue in the public eye. But
really, unless people are demonstrating in China, who are the world's biggest polluters, nothing's going to change. And we know that you're not allowed to demonstrate in China because we know what's been happening in Hong Kong. I mean, I don't want to be, the gainsayer here, and but I just wonder if it's just part of this whole approach that when you actually are having power taken from you, kind of officially, you fill that void and vacuum by protesting in other ways, hoping it gives you a voice. But if it does bring people together and give common cause, then I think that's a good thing.
But isn't Brexit showing us the importance of extra parliamentary politics? I mean, again, going back to what you said about the conflict between Parliament and the people, Boris Johnson is responding not to accountability to Parliament, but he's responding to accountability to more directly to the electorate, or at least a portion of the electorate. So we can't really say politics is just what happens in formal institutions. The other stuff, it can matter.
Perhaps what would be helpful in this debate is if people could look at, let's say, the last 10 years and say, well, actually here is what's changed. So the rise of electric cars, electric buses, all those kind of things that are out there. A lot of local authorities are taking the lead on this, and it might be quite good at this juncture to do a kind of audit of that and say, well, things have changed a bit, and maybe that's down to public pressure or not, and it would maybe help, because I think that's what I always feel with mass movements like this. It's where is it making a difference? So that would be a useful thing to find out, and that's something presumably that the Green Party should be doing.
The Committee on Climate Change does that. So it has a duty to publish regular reports, and it tells the government if they're on target to meet their climate change targets, and if not, where they should be taking action, and the government has to respond to that. And actually, that's a really good example of the influence of public pressure, because this is all back to the Climate Change Act of 2008, and the Climate Change Act was passed in a kind of rather unique political moment where all of the parties, I think all but 3 MPs in the House of Commons at the time, voted for it. There were mass letter writing campaigns coordinated by Friends of the Earth. You had a political campaign that put something in place institutionally, which meant that the government couldn't completely take its eye off the ball of the climate change issue in the future, because they have these regular audits, as you say, and these regular reporting requirements.
Okay, interesting you say that 3 MPs voted against. I was quite surprised to discover just a couple of weeks ago, I think, Angus Council, obviously one of our most rural councils, the SNP are in opposition there, and they put a motion about climate emergency, and several of the councillors responded that Angus was, and I quote, too rural to do anything about climate change. Now, given that it's our rural communities, who are first to notice the difference, timing of crops and all the rest of it, that was their attitude. Because, well, people had to use their cars. That's because you haven't got a public transport system that works. But there are huge grants available, for example, people turning to electric cars. But I thought that was a particularly localised and unique bit of climate denial from Angus City Council, but maybe we shouldn't expect anything more from them. Another local issue, still on the theme of protests, which seems to be what we're talking about this week, was yesterday Glasgow City Council overturned a decision to ban sectarian marches. So a couple of weeks ago they stopped a series of Republican and Loyalist marches happening in the city for fear of the same violence that had happened a few weeks before. But this week they overturned that decision, supposedly on the advice of the police, and 4 Loyalist marches took place. There were no incidents as far as has been reported, but there were something like 600 officers required to be there. The cost is huge. And the police's argument was, if they didn't let them go ahead, then people would protest sort of illegally and cause more trouble. Do you think that's a reasonable response from the police, Kenny?
In one sense, yes, it is. The police's job is to keep the peace, and if they think that shutting something down that is normally allowed, if they felt that was going to cause a bad reaction, then maybe it is better just to let it go. I am Catholic, and I would argue that I have in some sense been a victim of anti-Catholic hate crime. I mean, I would never phrase it like that, but I have been on the unpleasant end of orange walks, and I have no desire to ban them. It's weird. It's mostly the atheists in my circle who want them banned. Whereas I, who potentially I'm the person whose blood they want to be up to their knees in, and I wouldn't want it stopped. I absolutely wouldn't, because
why?
First of all, everybody's got a right to free speech, and provided they're not inciting violence or causing other trouble on the street.
But they've just said they want to be up to their knees in your blood. That's inciting some kind of.
That's the thing.
Hatred.
That's the thing. That's some of that bile, I think, that's got into the system. Some of the really kind of the intention to offend and the intention to cause trouble, I think, is a relatively new innovation. Certainly 10, 15 years ago, I don't remember there being that sort of heat around the orange walks. I mean, everybody hated them and everybody was annoyed by them, but nobody was afraid of them, or certainly fewer people were. And I think we've built them up into this thing where we've almost given the Orange Lodge a power that it shouldn't have based on its membership or its actual kind of the size and scope of what it is. Because we've said these are bad people and we need to stop them doing their drums and their
But
flutes.
isn't it the size of the issue? I had a quick look on Glasgow City Council website, and to date, and we're only 3/4 of the way through the year, there have been over 180 Loyalist marches, and there's only been 16 Republican marches. There were only 16 Republican marches in the whole of last year as well. Now, although the numbers of Loyalist marches are slightly down on maybe 2 or 3 years ago, 180, that's 4 or 5 a week. So it's no longer just around the anniversaries, which traditionally they were there to celebrate. So is there an argument for saying, well, okay, let's have them, but you've got to have equal numbers? Which doesn't mean that we want 180 Republican marches through Glasgow. It's just that the sheer size of it seems to be, from someone who is not affected directly. I'm brought up Protestant, but really nothing, but I happen to live near where some go by. It just seems that that's the scale of it. And that scale of it, presumably, has the potential then to be used by some people within the movement to turn the hatred that you were saying. And if you're saying 15 years ago people weren't frightened of the marches, you're kind of implying there's fear now, in which case, as a lawyer, Aileen, don't you think it's about time that debate about your right for free speech, but it shouldn't be at the cost of someone else's rights?
Well, and that is how the law approaches it. So this is all governed now ultimately by the European Convention on Human Rights. You have a right of freedom of association, right of freedom of assembly, and that can only be limited if, this is the technical terms, if it's in pursuit of a legitimate aim, and if it's proportionate. So if there's a fear of violence, if there's a fear of infringing the rights of other people, that's a legitimate aim, but still the restrictions you put on people's freedom to march have to be proportionate, and the courts don't like blanket bans. They prefer things to be approached on a case-by-case basis. And it's quite interesting, the police were saying, well, there'll be more violence if you don't allow this march than if you do, because that goes to that proportionality judgment. What is the proportionate thing to do here? Is it to allow the march to go ahead, or is it to ban it? So they've obviously made that judgment, and that would be influenced by these legal tests that they have to comply with.
I think it's slightly odd to let something go ahead because you think if you don't there'll be trouble, because that's kind of suggesting that the issue that's being allowed to go ahead carries trouble with it. The right of free speech and right of free association ties quite nicely into the next thing that I wanted to cover. When the Catalonian independence referendum took place, the crackdown by the Spanish authorities was outrageous, frankly. And the EU did absolutely nothing about it. As far as I know, I think Belgium was the only country to come out and condemn what happened. And the EU stood back and said, no, well, we can't do anything about this because it's an internal matter. Despite the fact that people were saying, no, people's rights of free association and freedom of speech were being denied. Now, I'm just back from a conference in Brussels over 2 days, which looked at the self-determination of stateless nations, which is what we are, which Scotland is, within the context of EU sovereignty. It was absolutely fascinating. And this issue around Catalonian self-determination in particular, and where the EU should or shouldn't intervene, was key to the debate. So what's your feeling about that particular issue before we go on to chat a little bit about that whole issue of what next for stateless nations within the EU?
Personally, I felt like the EU let itself down in saying nothing about Catalonia. Now, I don't know a lot about the situation in Catalonia, but when I can look at footage on the TV of cops hitting, attacking people who were acting entirely peacefully, I know that something bad is happening. That's not difficult, and it's not beyond the wit of the EU to find some form of words that said, this is unacceptable, Spain, and you can't do this. We don't like what you're doing, without necessarily saying we absolutely support the right of Catalonia to have a referendum on independence. It's not difficult to find language where they can tread that tightrope. I felt like it was a real slap in the face. I felt it was somewhat similar to how hostile certain people in the EU were to us in 2014. I thought there was a similarity where we were the ones saying we want to be part of the EU, we want to be a European country, and the people that you're siding with are viciously anti-Europe. They do everything in their power to undermine you, and we're here trying to do the right thing, and you're treating us like the outsiders. And I think it's not quite the same in Catalonia, because obviously the Spanish government is not as insane as the British government.
But it's interesting because you're right.
But I do think there was a real failure to say, actually, this is what Europe is about, is being able to have different views. The idea of the Europe of the regions. Well, here's a region that's trying to assert itself and isn't being allowed to. Surely you should be
But you can't have it
up for
both
that.
ways. You can't say these are matters for internal governments and we will take a standard position of studied neutrality. And then, as you're right, in the Scottish position, the president of the EU came out and said that Scotland would never, probably ever, be able to join the EU. Now, that had a huge impact on the vote and swung it. So one of the things we were asking for at this conference was that the EU has to develop some kind of roadmap or blueprint for exactly how stateless nations would begin to discuss and debate with the EU how they might remain in the EU if their national government breaks up. There obviously is a precedent if you join together again, so that was fine. So it'll be great for Northern Ireland. When they get their first border poll and they all agree to have a form United Ireland, they'll be fine. They'll be back into the EU, no problem. To hide behind there's no precedent for this is wrong. So are the EU fundamentally letting down some of its own founding principles by taking this position? What do you think?
Well, the EU will get involved in issues like this in extreme cases, so that the member states are obliged to comply with principles of the rule of law and protection of fundamental rights and so on, and they will condemn certain breaches. So there have been issues in Austria and in Hungary, where you've had attacks on judges and so on. They will say certain things, but I think you're in, again, quite tricky territory. Again, the nature of the EU as an institution is contested. There are sensitivities around about its extension into matters of internal sovereignty, internal politics, and I don't pretend to understand exactly what the politics are of this, but I'm not wholly surprised that they didn't say anything. Now, having said that, the other legal Europe, I think, is almost certain to get involved in the Catalonian situation, because I think there will be appeals or applications eventually to the European Court of Human Rights, and we might see some interesting and important decisions from them, but that will take some time before those come through.
I mean, the EU needs reform. I think we all agree that. So of the various we were tasked at this conference with coming up with solutions of how to make this happen, which was interesting in 2 days. But there were a number of things came up. So you talked about it being a union of the regions, and obviously there is the Committee of the Regions that was formed. And the idea of that was to exactly do that, was to give regions, and therefore often devolved administrations, more of a say. But it hasn't happened, because national governments haven't wanted to give them that say. So there was a suggestion that could have perhaps formed a kind of Senate, if you like. And it would seem to me that if a devolved administration has legal competency over a specific issue, and that issue is under the ultimate control of the EU, like fishing in Scotland, that Scotland should have been always able to have a seat at that table and not be at the whim of a national government saying, well, we'll send you or we'll not send you, and actually we're not going to send you, we're going to send somebody who's got responsibility for bees, who's a peer of the realm. And that's, I would have thought, a fairly, not a simple thing, because nothing about the EU is simple, but that's one potential reform. That national governments, there should be some kind of body constituted, maybe within the Committee of Regions or separately, that is a form of Senate, and that might help. I don't know. Do you think that's even feasible?
Well, not every country, not every member state has the same sort of regional structure. So you've got issues about who would be getting represented and who would not. But I think that goes back to that issue about what kind of institution is the EU. You've always got this tension between the federalising model, where you might want to extend notions of subsidiarity down to regional levels, but then the intergovernmental model, where the member states are in charge and it's national governments, and those two things are always in tension. I can just imagine the reaction of the UK government if we were staying in the EU to your kind of proposal. They would be very, very resistant to any sort of suggestion that the EU should be interfering in matters of internal territorial organisation. And there will be there'll be similar sensitivities in some other member states.
But giving any devolved administration the opportunity to have its voice heard where there's a direct impact in an area where they have legal competency isn't giving power away. The power's already been given away to Scotland by the national government of the UK. It just seems ridiculous that that's not even feasible. And you're right, obviously not all countries in the EU have a devolved or federal system. but Germany does. And, if Germany wants it to happen, then I would think it will happen. So maybe actually we should be talking to the German government about pushing this forward, because obviously within the German federal structure, the individual landers do have amazing amounts of power.
Yeah.
And it might stop some regions who want to break away and never return to the EU, Bavaria being one, actually thinking, so a lot of the toxicity around the EU, a lot of things that people, the sovereignty issues, the things that people are not happy about, the high-handed nature, might be affected and changed, if you like, if there was that kind of approach, along with lots of other reform.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of subsidiarity, it's supposed to be this great guiding principle of the EU, and I think it's more honoured in the breach. I mean, I think there's much more is done by heads of government in the EU. I think there is a place for a bigger voice for regions, states, landes, countries like Scotland. The most countries in Europe have a something more like a federal structure. Certainly have more responsibility at lower levels of government. I don't think many have the particular quirk that Scotland has, where we're technically in control of our own fishing, where that's a specific EU policy issue, big policy, one of the big policy issues that the EU covers. But there is just this inevitable tension where you have a political union between 28 and soon to be 27 countries that don't all have the same ways of doing things, don't have the same types of government, don't have the same responsibilities of government, don't have anything like the same structures, aren't even on anything like the same election cycles. It makes managing the EU a very, very weighty and complex process. I think.
So you're saying the bureaucracy gets in the way of actual good governance or good government?
Yeah, I mean, if you figure that the EU is just slightly bigger than the US in terms of population, the US works far more smoothly because it has a system that's designed to work with itself. Whereas it's almost like we all have different plugs and we're all trying to connect to the same system, which, obviously is actually kind of what travelling in Europe is like. But there is that sense that, what Scotland's situation is doesn't really fit with what, say, Bavaria's situation is. And that doesn't really quite fit with how...
Well, Bavaria just wants to be independent and have no more to do with the EU. In the same way that Wallonia would quite like to have nothing more to do with the EU.
I was going to say, but even then, Bavaria is not the same kind of thing as Wallonia, or as the French-speaking people of Belgium, who have their own kind of... there's a kind of difference between the group, anyway. But you know what I mean? There's all these different things that just don't fit together very well, and I think... If you were an EU integrationist, one of the things you might want to do is start trying to regularise some of those things.
Or allow differentiated integration, the so-called multi-speed Europe idea, which is that not all countries need to sign up for everything.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's gaining in a lot of interest. It might allow some... And I think if David Cameron had been able to negotiate some real concessions about issues around membership, we would probably never have had an EU referendum, if I'm honest.
Maybe.
And it might be the sorts of thing that stops some countries who have certain things about membership look differently. I mean, there is differentiated integration anyway. We're not all in Schengen. We're not all in the Eurozone. The EFTA countries themselves are a differentiated integration. And that might be a way for stateless nations to begin a different relationship with the EU than currently. But I think reform has to happen. There were lots of challenging questions asked in Brussels, but the most challenging question, I had to say, it did actually make me stop and think, because the 2 days came up with quite interesting ideas, but it also threw up, obviously, a lot of the huge issues there are with Europe. And someone said to me, Scotland is clearly a social democratic country. And while I was sitting there puffing out my little chest going, yes, we are, they said, why in hell's name would you want to be part of the EU with its neoliberal attitude and its basis in capitalism? And I thought, Oh, that's a really good question. But we do. But I think, actually, I mean, this is the whole thing that Brexit's thrown up, and it's impossible to know what will happen in the future. But I got a distinct impression, in fact, more than a distinct impression, I was told that the reason that there's been this softening in attitude to Scotland is because by the time we ask again the question, could we join, we will be out of Europe. So we will simply be another state who wishes to join. We won't have been seen to break what we call the sort of EU loyalty club. You know, we haven't upset anybody too much, and I think that's the real difference, which is tremendously good for us, should that be the route we go down, full membership, not just maybe in EFTA. But it's no comfort at all to colleagues in Catalonia or Flanders or other parts of the EU who are really wanting to move on. And yet there seems to be a real sense within the EU, we've got to get this right, or more Brexits might happen. And I think the other issue that frightens the EU is they're scared of nationalism. And you can understand that given our last 100 years of history. And they have to realise there's more than one type of nationalism. And I think they're beginning to recognise the sorts of civic nationalism of some countries who want self-determination, but they're worried that actually it's just another rise of the right. And they're seeing that. Hungary's a classic example. So it's an interesting time, I think. Whether anything will change, I don't know. If there are any changes for stateless nations, we'll be well out of it by then, so it won't benefit us. But it was really good to be invited. I was there to represent Women for Independence, and it was, I mean, tremendous. Lots of practitioner organisations, lots of constitutional lawyers and academics. So I had to really concentrate hard for the 2 days, but I really did enjoy being there. And it was the day that I made my presentation was 5 years to the day that I didn't see Scotland gain her independence from the UK, so it was quite poignant. So on that, and the time that's left to us, let's just chat about the 5-year anniversary, how you feel that was handled, and how you think the media covered it, and where you stand yourself now, as committed, less committed, more questions, fewer questions, and ultimately, is it going to be a yes? So over to you both.
Well, I was at a really interesting workshop organised by the Centre on Constitutional Change at Edinburgh University, and I was paying attention to that rather than what else was going on. But it was a very strange sort of experience, because on the one hand, the sense in the room was of the inevitability of a second independence referendum, and so there was a lot of discussion about how we get back into the EU, and issues about international recognition and all of this kind of stuff, and how would the arguments be different if if the rest of the UK is out of the EU, and would the experience of trying to leave the EU, would that have any impact? All of that kind of stuff, all around about, well, this is going to happen when we're just discussing what it'll be like. But at the same time, there was a sort of a discussion about, well, how do we get to a second referendum? And that was a much, well, at the moment, it's very, very difficult to see the path to a second referendum. And there was, no clear answer to that at all. So you've got this mismatch of, it's inevitable, but nobody knew how we were going to get to that point.
Yeah, well, I was in here on Wednesday. We went and we spoke to Ian Blackford in town. They were out with the YSI, the Young Scots for Independence. I mean, it's flown by 5 years. It doesn't seem anything like that long. Maybe that's just a sign that I'm getting old. But yeah, it's really flown by, and a lot has changed. Obviously, everything that's happened with Brexit has kind of thrown everything up in the air. But at the same time, quite a lot hasn't changed. A lot of the discussion that we're having around independence is exactly the same conversations we were having in 2014. And in some sense, that's a bit of a worry, that we haven't kind of moved on, that we are still having arguments about being allowed into the EU, or what kind of currency are we going to use. I mean, these things should be things that people are bored of talking about by now, even if the answers aren't there yet. I mean, the answers should be there, but and I think Aileen, you made a good point. The question, if you ask people, will we be independent at some time in the relatively near future, I think most people would say, yeah, probably. But when you ask, how are we going to get there, it's a lot more vague. It's not clear at this stage at all how we actually get a referendum.
Well, this also came up at Brussels,
okay.
And so, and I've heard other people. Well, I'm not saying it's an answer, but it was it was an interesting discussion, and I have heard this suggested by other people. So, we know that self-determination is a human right, but we also know that a unilateral declaration of self-determination can be made, but there is no right for it to be acted on. So it doesn't, and so, and in fact, almost the opposite, it's likely not to be acted on. So there's no requirement for anyone to recognise it, which is why Nicola Sturgeon's always been absolutely firm. No UDI, no dissolving the union overnight. She said we'd have a great party, we'd have a great hangover on the Monday morning, and then discover nobody wanted to speak to us. However, and this is based on case law from the issues around the Quebecois in Canada. So although there's no right to have your unilateral declaration of self-determination acted on, there is also no automatic right for a government not to take part in reasonable negotiations, to refuse to take part in reasonable negotiations. So one of the things that's been suggested is if there's a general election and the SNP get another 50 odd seats, or certainly improve on where they are at the moment, or if it has to spill over into being part of the mandate for the Scottish general election and there's an independence majority in Holyrood, that actually at that point the Scottish Government has to go to the Parliament in Westminster and say, the mandate is now here, so you have no option but to start negotiating with us. So we're almost not asking, you would need to be a confirmatory referendum, obviously, at some point to make the people's voice heard, but that negotiations should start. And I think that's quite an interesting approach, and that might be the way forward. What do you think?
Maybe. The Canadian,
the lawyer hedging her bets.
Well, the Canadian case is very interesting, but of course the Canadian case is about the Canadian Constitution.
Indeed.
And there is no guarantee, and in fact it seems to me quite unlikely that the same approach would be taken in the UK context. Whether or not I hear this argument made all the time, there is this right to self-determination, but from what I understand of that case law, and I'm not an international lawyer, it doesn't really apply to people like us. It's for oppressed minorities. And, a country which has its own parliament is going to struggle to argue that it's an oppressed national minority. So I think the international arguments, whilst rhetorically useful, I don't think they really provide us with a way out. And as I understand it, and this was confirmed very strongly by a former UK diplomat who was at this meeting I was at last week, what really matters for international recognition is the attitude of the former state. Mm-hmm. So if the former state recognises the seceding state, then international recognition is likely to follow from that. If they don't, then international recognition is really unlikely.
Yes, but if they entered into negotiations in good faith because they felt they had no option, then by nature of that would almost be agreeing to the existence of the seceding state. But it's a bit Alice in Wonderland, and it may never happen. But I do think you're right. We need to be looking at alternative ways, and while we're still debating things like the currency, until we get an answer on that, we need to debate it. And the other thing, and we don't have time to go into it today, so maybe for another programme, is the border might become an issue, because we would then have a land border with a non-EU state, and that was the thing that better together, there'll be a hard border, people going, that's a nonsense. Well, there might be. So what happens in Northern Ireland over the hard border is tremendously important, because the thought of a hard border will affect people. So I agree, we're all sure it's going to happen, but getting there is going to be difficult. So it's been a tremendous morning. We've covered a lot. I think we've talked about protests in various types. We didn't get a chance to talk about the poor guy who told Boris Johnson to take his cameras and shove them. But he's been getting into trouble on social media because Laura Kuenssberg outed him as a Labour person. Ooh, shock horror. And obviously Brexit has dominated everything, as was going to. So thank you very much to you both. Thank you for watching. We say this at the end of every programme. Producing a television programme is expensive. If you would like to donate, £5 a month would help Broadcasting Scotland continue. And there are plans to have develop a Scottish question type format, and we need more people to sign up to the website. So if you've enjoyed it today, if you're watching it as it's happening, please feel free to retweet it, get your friends. If you're watching it on catch up, heaven, some of these questions might have been answered by then. Who knows? We might not have a Scottish Parliament next week. They might suspend us as well, in which case maybe we will be a minority and oppressed people. So ladies and gentlemen, my guests, thank you so much, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.